Hello everyone. So this is the top up to the first week's lecture that I was sort of telling you about. I think if you review the slides, especially those first few, you'll really get a sense of how we really drill down into the module aims and learning outcomes, and hopefully with the seminar as well, you're going to think a little bit about the assessment. So the portion that I didn't manage to get to was really looking at each section in a little bit more detail, and those are the sections, if you look in the module handbook, that are kind of outlined. So we've given you little kind of abstract descriptors for each week. We've also broken that down further by asking some questions just to get you thinking, as well as kind of identifying particular texts that you might want to go to kind of unlock some reading. So there's kind of general reading there and more tailored reading actually in the module handbook. And you can also access through the resources online tab on Blackboard, which will take you to this kind of interactive reading list, which I think is very, very useful. So the first section that we're going to look at, and we're going to spend a couple of weeks on looking at George Gissing's New Grub Street, and also then following that up with The Story of a Modern Woman. We're going to be thinking about journalism and literary work. So the work that we're doing on the seminar today, looking at ideas from Bourdieu, thinking about cultural capital, I think we can start to kind of extrapolate from that and sort of see the ways in which journalism, literary work, and actually the role of the clerk as well are kind of configured. So as I was saying to you, I'm really interested next week in offering you kind of a reading of that particular text, and I want to think about this role of the clerk specifically in that. And we're going to return to Bourdieu both in part in kind of the follow-up seminars to that, but I think it'll work really well when we start to look at Dorian Gray as well. So we're beginning to think about this kind of growth of the reading populace and the way in which the publishing industry are kind of either promoting that kind of popularity in terms of reading, but also catering for it. So this idea of mass producing novels, being able to use cheap publishing paper, the actual decrease of tax on paper as well at this period also caused publishing costs to be greatly reduced, which meant that publishing houses could sell books to a cheaper amount, which meant more borrowing libraries were sort of set up to sort of cater both for the demand, but there's also this kind of overproduction of books as well. You've also got the reshaping at this time of the way in which publishers are hired and paying writers, and that's a real concern I think in New Grub Street. So have a look and see within the text the kind of the periodicals that are referred to, and the way in which I suppose this middle class writer is talking about the growth of available readers. So moving on from that, we're going to spend a couple of weeks looking at the city, looking particularly actually at murder in the city. So thinking about the ways in which we might construct ideas of kind of imperial empire, and the way in which perhaps narrators are kind of exploring the East End of London as though it's this terra incognita, this strange and exotic land as well. So the lecture actually that week will really kind of begin to explore some of those ideas. And those of you who've got sort of a history background, you might want to sort of think about particular changes in terms of pollution and pollution laws at this particular time, which were causing terrible mortality rates, particularly amongst children. So actually it was a very, very dangerous place to be born into. 19th century industrialised London, some areas life expectancy was really very low indeed. Now, if you're interested, particularly I think with this kind of murderous spin on things, there's a couple of books that I think are really, really accessible. They're quite popularist though, so do bear that in mind. There's Catherine Arnold's book, The Worst Street in London, which gives you really a cultural history of Dorset Street in London, the amount of murders and sort of poverty that sort of brought people down in that particular area in the East End. And then you've got somebody like Peter Ackroyd with his biography of London, which, although it's a massive book, you could kind of dip in and out of. And he talks about particular land and locality as kind of creating this kind of strain of violence. Now, whilst I don't agree with his reading, I think there's certain socio-economic and political reasons for why this area might be seen in a kind of a negative light in particular. So with this kind of mass industrialisation and mobilisation of the 19th century, you have the critic Raymond Williams Marxist critic, writing in his book The Country and the City, talking about, for the first time, more people living in the cities in the UK than were actually living in arable or farming communities. And part of this, I think, part of the intensification of industrialisation within the city catered for this kind of nostalgia to a pastoral ideal. So if you just think back to maybe some of the Blake poetry, maybe Wordsworth, the work you've done on Romanticism, think about the dichotomy between representations of the city and the country, and think about how that's being realised as well. Give you a nice insight, I think, into some of the things that we're going to look at here. So you might want to have a little read through, you might want to think as well about Jack the Ripper. We're going to sort of think about the way in which the Ripper is kind of configured in terms of possible work, the way in which he dispatches his victims is seen to have a certain level of expertise. Another useful text actually to unlock this might be something like Thomas de Quincey's On Murder, considered as one of the fine arts. So that's actually something you can download from Project Gutenberg. It's a fabulous essay. It's really interesting. Moving on then, we're going to look at some photographs, going to think about ways of reading photographs and reading art. And going back, I think, to what we were talking about today in terms of sort of Bourdieu and the way in which we might value art, and to what extent does the artist then have a kind of a liberation of a kind of freedom. This kind of idea of freedom is quite similar to another critic, actually, Jacques Derrida, who does talk about the differences between craft and art. So that might be something you want to kind of look at and get interested in. I'm going to focus in particular, when we look at Dorian Gray, I think, on the manifesto type opening, the preface. So it's worth comparing actually some of the different sort of prefaces to the novel. Again, you can use Project Gutenberg just to get a useful kind of insight to that. There's been some recent republications actually of Picture of Dorian Gray, which use a later publication, so using the kind of later publication, which is more censored, and the earlier kind of more salacious version of the text, which is quite interesting. So some new editing and new censorship perhaps coming to light through those different examples. The other kind of area that I really want to draw out is thinking about employability. You've maybe thought about going on and doing a master's. We've got an MRes here at Sheffield Hallam. You might want to think about undertaking further study elsewhere, and I can give you some advice about where you might look depending on your area of expertise, what it is that you're looking to do. A number of students looking to go into teaching are getting those kind of master's level subject knowledge to help them obviously in their careers sort of going forward. So what I want to do is ensure, both through the assessment and also through the teaching, that you really get a sense of this ability to kind of articulate your development. It's really important. And as well, that you're very keen and clear on what it is you've got that you can access after graduation. So you've actually got access to the Careers Centre and support from Careers Guidance for a further 3 years beyond graduation, which is really fantastic, and you should really think about making the most of that. It's not too early, it's not too late to be thinking about it, so we'll be looking at that in the midpoint really of the module. We'll then turn our attention towards technology, and I kind of hinted that the final two sections, the technology section and also the futures at work section, are really thinking about the ways in which technology might be seen to kind of stand in for or replace the worker. So to what extent is technology liberating the workforce? And I think I was using the analogy of being stuck in front of email for kind of a long time. So technology can be also perceived to be sort of burdensome. You might want to consider the Luddites and the sort of the smashing of equipment, which I think when I first heard about that, I sort of thought, what a strangely backward thing to do. That seems absolutely crazy. Reflecting on it now as an adult, you sort of see from the perspective of those workers that these machines were replacing the human factor, that, these workers, if they couldn't find another job, in all likelihood, without the welfare state, would actually starve and, get in a very difficult pickle indeed. So we're going to approach a number of texts in this section. I'm going to think about the role of the typewriter as a cultural artefact. It's really interesting. And the way in perhaps that kind of role, that role of the clerk, that role of the minute taker, changes. So in the earlier examples, it's very often a man who's fulfilling that role. And in these later examples, looking at Mina and the typewriter girl, you've got this kind of inverted gender that it's actually the women who are actually engaging with the typewriter, or you might kind of consider why that is. So I also said we're going to look at Dracula at this point. So on your reading and rereading of the novel, really focus in, look at technology in particular, and really sort of see it, I think, in a new light. And then finally, we're going to focus in on utopian and dystopian fiction, see the ways in which the examples we've got are really kind of challenging what's going on at the time, or indeed a response to it. So you might be familiar with Rosemary Jackson's work on fantasy as a subversion of reality. It's a very slim volume looking at ideas of fantasy fiction in particular. And she talks about this notion of fantasy or science fiction as being a kind of a response, being a direct political response to the now. So what it is that that writer is seeing as their kind of reality. So it'd be interesting. You might want to bring some of your knowledge of other dystopian fictions, think through maybe later and also earlier examples. So this term utopia comes obviously from Thomas More's work, Utopia, which itself is to do with productivity, it's to do with the Enclosure Act, and it's to do with the sort of the breaking down then between different boroughs. So it's a very sort of political text there. So that brings me to the end of this little top up. I hope you find it useful. Please do contact me if anything's unclear. If not, get ahead with the reading. Gissing, like I say, is a large novel, so please do try and get through as much of that as you can. And be thinking as you're reading to be picking out some of those ideas of cultural capital, to be picking up on some of those Marxist ideas as well, and kind of really building on the seminar. And I'll see you next week.